Hi everybody and welcome to part 2 of my video series covering the Z3660 accelerator for big box Amigas. In this part I'm going to be covering some of the extra features that are found specifically on this expansion that make it a real contender for the best all-in-one accelerator you can get for your Amiga. If you watched part 1 of the video, I covered the basic setup of the Z3660 card and some benchmarks of the CPU, memory and SD card performance on this card. But in this part, I'm going to be covering HDMI output, audio output and Ethernet connections, which are things that this card brings to the party. Now, before we dig into that in earnest, I think there are some physical considerations we need to take into account. And just as a reminder, I've got the Z3660 here set up in my A4000D, but as I showed you in the previous part, this card also fits the A3000D. But again, there are going to be those physical considerations to think about. And what do I mean when I say that? Well, if we take a look here at the HDMI connector on the Z-Turn daughter board here, there isn't a lot of clearance between that connector and the 68060 chip here. And if we use a conventional HDMI cable like this one, that's just simply going to foul on the heatsink on top of the 060, if not the chip itself. So what I have done is to get hold of a low profile HDMI connector here, much shorter than a traditional HDMI connector, and that's going to enable me to use the HDMI output socket. The same is true also for Ethernet. Perhaps it's less of a problem with Ethernet, but that socket there, a normal Ethernet connector is again quite long because of the strain relief part of the cable. I've got a sort of low profile one here which will enable me to connect to the socket okay, again without fouling on the heatsink and fan. And I'll be able to run these cables around the side of the CPU and ultimately out of the back of the case, perhaps through the hole which you can't quite see here, but out the back of the A4000D. There's a sort of accessory port here which I can use to run the cables outside, or failing that, out through the Zorro slot connectors. So I'm going to set all that up so that we can use the inputs and outputs there, and then we'll come back to the software side of this and setting it all up within Amiga OS. So the cables are plugged in, as you can see, and with a bit of careful cable management there, I managed to route the cables around the heatsink and fan on the 68060. So all good there. Now turning to the workbench view, it's time to install some software, and I think the place to start here is to try and get the RTG drivers working first. But as to drivers, let's just look through what we've got. So I have taken the ADF file that comes with as part of the software package for the Z3660 and added that into my HDF file. So that's all available here. And in fact, let's make sure we can see everything that's there. So here is the Z-Top application that I featured in part 1. I'm not going to cover that again. And then we've got various other support files in devs, or for devs, for libs and for C. So let's just step through those briefly. First of all, devs, we've got a driver to support SCSI or SD to SCSI support. Because I selected the ROM as part of the configuration process in part 1, this SCSI device is already active for me. But if you're not going to use the ROM and not going to therefore boot from the HDF file, then you can use this device to access HDF files on the SD card. So I'm done with that. I'm going to skip over that. We've got some drivers for AHI in these two folders here. We've got drivers for networking and then monitors. So it's this one that I need to come back to in a minute. Maybe let's just put that to one side. And then in libs, what have we got? Well, support for MHI and my Picasso driver. Again, let's put that to one side for a moment. And then in C, what do I have here? AX MP3, so that looks like something to do with playing MP3 files, so MHI. So if I'm going to start with setting up RTG, it's Picasso 96 that I need to work through first of all. As you may recall from part 1, I've already copied my entire workbench setup here from another machine, and that other machine already had Picasso 96 installed on it. In essence, all the core files are there already. It's just these two that I need to set up. So let's go ahead and put them in the right places. So first of all, let me find my, oh, excuse me. I tell you what, let's do this more simply because I can't remember exactly what I called it. Right. Go to the right directory. And Picasso 96. And there's the definition file of the hardware that I need to use under Picasso 96. So P96 has this somewhat strange setup that you need a hardware definition file, the .card file here, but you also need a monitor file as well that you put in a different place. But now, for now, let's copy this file to the correct directory there within libs. And that should give me access to the hardware. I can minimize that, and I have dealt with this one. But now what I should be able to do is double click the monitor file, which will one time only, as things currently stand, just set up the monitor using that hardware definition. And basically you find out pretty quickly whether you have set things up right, because either this works and the machine carries on comfortably and we can move on to the next step, or the machine will hang or crash at this point and then something is wrong with your P96 setup. So let's just double click, and life seems to be okay, so that's a good sign. We'll come back to setting this up to be a permanent available screen mode in a minute, but let's just carry on for now with it being temporary while we're just making sure everything is working properly. So the next thing I have to do in Picasso 96 is to find the icon for Picasso 96 mode, give that a double click, and we're into the setup of P96 modes. This is running off the bottom of the screen just because we're running in that non-interlaced screen mode at the moment, but all the relevant information is here. What I need to do is go into the menus and attach setting to my Z3660 board. That is relating to the Z3660 card hardware definition, and it's telling me that there are a lot of resolutions here that are not going to work for my setup. So I'm just going to OK to all through all of these, just so that we get somewhere sensible. And then let's test one of these modes. So at the moment I'm set up in a 256 color mode, a nice chunky screen with a really high refresh rate, 92 Hertz. So I am not sure that OSSC is going to cope with this when we switch over. So I might have to just feed the HDMI output straight into the capture hardware that I've got here. But let's just give this a go and do a test. So it's open my screen now. Let's try and switch over and see if I can find that. And I can't, so what we're going to do is just bypass the OSSC at this point. And look at that, that's working beautifully. So that just shows Picasso 96 is all working fine. So what I need to do now is come out and make those changes permanent. So let's just do that. Switch back to native Amiga feed because I don't have a monitor switcher here. And we're back in the native Amiga mode, all made a little bit harder because I don't have a proper monitor switcher. Anyway, let's make these settings permanent now. So the way to do that is to click Save here. And it's telling me that I will need to reboot, which is fair enough. So reboot that. And after a pause, just to allow any disk activity to end, I can actually reboot. So let's come back when Workbench has loaded again. So we're back in Workbench, and what I've got to do is make those changes permanent. And the way to do that is to copy that monitor file into my devs monitors directory. So let's find that here. So that's the destination, if you like. Where's the source? Let's find that quickly. There's my monitor file. Close some of these other windows, and I can drop that in there now, which will load the monitor automatically at startup. If I want to use it now, which I do, I've got to double click it because obviously it wasn't there when we did the monitor, the machine startup. So we're almost at the end of this somewhat arduous process. We can go back into prefs, and now I should find all my Z3660 screen modes here, which I can. Looking wonderful. Now, it is showing 32-bit screen modes here, but as far as I know, those are not enabled. So let's stay away from them. And I think I'm just going to start with a fairly regular 16-bit screen mode. Let's give that a test. Again, I'll have to fiddle around with the connections at the back here to switch between the monitors so we can see what's going on. But let's start with that as a test. And doesn't that look wonderful? So that's going to auto exit shortly, and we'll go back to native Amiga view, but we're almost there. So that worked fine. Now I just click save, and that will make that permanent and put Workbench onto that lovely RTG screen. And we're there, at last. A nice high resolution screen. I don't feel like I'm being squashed up into a letterbox to actually use the machine. How wonderful is that? And of course, from here now, because I'm in one RTG screen, it's a lot easier to shift to another one if I want to up the resolution or the screen depth or whatever. So that is RTG. I'm going to do some benchmarking of this screen mode now, just to check it against other systems and see how we get on, and I'll come back to that later on. And so onwards now, beyond RTG graphics, let's look at networking next. So I'm back to my desktop here, I should say Workbench, shouldn't I really? And there is my set of drivers. So let's just see all of those, and within those devs, and then devs networks. And this is the file to get the networking right. So I need to copy this across to the right Workbench area and find that in my existing setup, which for some reason is very, very narrow. Right, devs networks, here we go, get rid of that. And I don't need these devices that are in here already. These must all be from earlier incarnations of whatever I was doing on my other machine. So let's just get rid of some of these just to avoid any confusion. And copy across Z3660 net.device. Right, and now it's a question of making sure that my software is pointing to this device correctly. And my setups use Genesis and therefore METCP and all set up that way. So that's what I'm used to. And so what I really need to do, therefore, is simply point over my preferences that are already set up here with it for an Xsurf device. I need to edit that, and instead point to my Z3660 device instead. So where is the driver set? Here we are. I can just simply edit that. Like that. Hit OK. And save that. Now, in principle, that should mean that when I hit Genesis here, it's automatically going to connect. And so it has. It's actually connected to my network storage automatically because that's how I'd had this configuration set up before. Let's just try a quick browse and go into Aminet or Aminet if you insist. And there we are, 10th of March. So that's the current date. That's when I'm recording this. So that is all working wonderfully, and that was all rather painless. I guess the pain really is in the creation and setup of AMI TCP in the first place, which can be a bit painful, but once you've got there, switching over to the new device, really straightforward. Again, I'll do some benchmarking of network performance here and be back with that later on. Okay, so that was RTG and then networking. Now let's move on to AHI audio modes. So again, there's a little bit of setup to do here. Let's open the driver file once more and into devs, make that a bit bigger. And we've got a few files to move across here in the AHI and audio modes folders. So they need to go into devs. Let's move this down a bit so we can see what we're doing and open it up. And somewhere along here we have AHI. So that's my existing AHI directory and my existing audio modes. So those are the ones I need out of dev, so I can get rid of all of that. AHI, I've already got Paula.audio and filesave.audio as my default AHI devices. Now I can add in the Z3660 AX audio, and similarly with I've lost it. Similarly with screen modes, Paula and file save, so I could do the same thing here and move across the Z3660 AX. Now, if memory serves, I have to do one more thing, and that is add audio modes. So let's just check that I'm using the right, there we go, add the right command line, add audio modes, and I think it's as simple as Z3660 AX, object not found. So maybe I need to give it a path name, devs, audio modes. Right, there we are. Now, in theory, that should allow me now within AHI to select, there we go, Z3660 AX's device, and that's exactly what's here. So again, let's make this window a bit bigger and then we can see what's going on. So I have the standard 16-bit stereo mode or a plus mode. Not entirely clear what the difference is between those two, given this is a music unit, but let's move on to a sound unit. And again, no particular difference because I don't have any audio inputs. So I know some software insists on plus mode, so let's just stick with that. And also for my music unit, yeah, plus, might as well select this with all units, and then they are all playing through the Z3660 AX music device, AHI device, so save that. And then, as far as I recall, I have Amega Amp prefs set up to use AHI Unit 2, so that will also now point to the Z3660 AX device driver, so that's all good. I can just use that and then launch into Amega Amp. And what I'm going to do actually just before we start Amega Amp is open up TinyMeter Okay, preferences error, don't really care about that. And this is going to just keep track of CPU usage. So at the moment you can see basically the A60 here, which is running at 50 megahertz, by the way, is almost entirely idle, 96% free. We're going to play an MP3 and just see CPU usage, and this might be interesting to come back to when we use MHI, but for now let's just play a sample MP3 file. And actually what I will do is, just before I get this playing, I am going to turn off the microphone, going to mute my mic and turn on the device volume so you can hear this playing directly through the HDMI output. So here we go, we'll just play a few seconds of this and then I'll be back.
Yeah.
And I'm back. So that just showed that MP3 is playing absolutely fine there, and it's continuing to play, it's just you can't hear it. But what we can do here is look at the CPU usage, and actually it's only about 1/3 of the processor's time that is free, so it's more or less spending 2/3 of its time just decoding the MP3s. So that's going to give us a yardstick when we come to MHI. But let's just stop that music now and set up MHI. Now, in order to do that, once again, I've got to get all the configuration files in the right places. So let's just go and find those all over again. I've got a couple of them that I need to sort out. There's this one in C, which is some sort of executable, and also in libs here I have, let's do that properly, an MHI directory with an MHI library. Yeah, there, MHI Z3660 library. So those are the ones I've got to sort out. I'm always in two minds with these things, whether it's better to do it from the command line or just drag and drop, but let's just drag and drop for the sake of argument this time. Where's my libs folder? There, that is, there it is. So expand that a little bit. I'm just going to drag that across. So that's done that and that. And also there's my C, so even better. Don't really have to do a great deal to just get that in there. And I must have already done that. So, okay, replace what's already there. Right. Let's get rid of all those icons and we can get back to where we were before. Go into Amiga Amp Prefs, and this time system instead of program. So system, in the system I had my engine set up as mpega.library. I can now switch that over to MHI driver, and now I need to identify where my MHI library is, and it's not this thing, whatever that is. I need to find my MHI Z3660 library there. So that should do that. Save, and let's try again with that MP3. And I'll just cut over so that you can hear it again.
Yeah.
And that's probably enough of that. You get the gist of what's going on there. The important thing here is just look at this CPU free counter even while the MP3 is playing. It precisely what you'd hope to be happening. All the hardware on the Z-Turn board is handling all the decoding, and our 68060 is barely having to do anything at all. So really successful there. So we're drawing towards the close of the hardware setup. It hasn't been that painful, largely because I had things like Genesis, AMI TCP, whatever you want to call it, and Picasso already set up. Also, Amega Amp and AHI already set up. If you're going to have to do that from scratch, then some care is needed to get that all up and running properly. But otherwise, getting the drivers for the Z3660 up and running isn't that problematic. All good. In which case, I think all that remains now is to compare this card via some benchmarks, and moreover to then do an overall review of what do we think of the Z3660. And so to the benchmarks. I spent a couple of days solidly running benchmarks of different kinds on the different speed configurations of the Z3660 and comparing them against comparator cards for you. It's also taken quite a bit of time to process all that information, the thousands of numbers, and turn them into something meaningful. But let me walk you through what I've found so far. First of all, CPU speed. Let me repeat this from part one of this video. Basically, what these stats are showing us is that the Z3660 behaves exactly like any other 68060 accelerator for the big box Amiga at the same clock speed. It produces exactly the same raw CPU speed. So let's move on. What about memory speed? Well, I found in part one that the memory speed of the Z3660 is a little bit down compared to other accelerators, but bearing in mind this is still beta firmware, so we might see some improvements here. But this is one area where other CPU accelerators do have the advantage, particularly the BFG 9060, which, to be honest, reigns supreme in this area. And to repeat the results from the SD card access via the SCSI emulation that I showed in part one. Again, some pretty impressive results here. Let's call that 10 plus megabytes a second read and write speed, which really does make the Amiga feel pretty rapid to use and is a definite plus. But that's repeating the benchmarks we had before. Let's move on now to think about RTG, etc. The first thing with this is that RTG results were very difficult to make any sense out of. So what I've tried to do here is to capture some of the more meaningful results that I think give a more accurate sense of speed overall, because the fact is you get, for different graphics cards, numbers that are all over the place in comparison to each other. So first of all, these three tests using P96 speed, right pixel, right chunky pixels, and blip bitmap, those are all sort of raw graphics routines for moving information around. And you can see the scores there for the Z3660 with an onboard, its onboard retargetable graphics. I also put in the same machine what you might call the top level classic card of the time, which is the Picasso 4, just to see what the difference would be if you compare those two in otherwise exactly the same machine. And if you look at pure graphics place, then you get that delta that I've got in the final column there. Over 100% is saying that the alternative to the Z3660 is faster, less than 100% is saying it's slower. So this is showing that with the deltas of 105%, 151, 115, the Picasso 4 is a little bit faster than the Z3660's onboard graphics capability in these operations. But let's move on a bit, because it's not all about direct graphics operations. P96 speed also measures other things that are more closely aligned to the feel within intuition. So we've got open window, move window, and the console output there. And here you can see there is a different message coming through from the data, particularly the bottom two rows there, where the onboard graphics is significantly faster than Picasso 4 at things like moving windows and console output.
So the answer is, which one's faster out of the Z3660 and a Picasso 4? Well, it depends what you're doing, which I guess is what you would expect the outcome to be. But perhaps to overgeneralize a little bit, if you are doing more raw graphics operations, then perhaps the top three rows tell more of a story, and the Z3660 isn't necessarily the fastest card around. But if you are simply working in Workbench and moving windows around, doing graphical output, text output, that kind of thing, then actually the Z3660 might be as fast, if not faster, than other cards. But that's a comparison so far against what you might call a classic solution, the Picasso 4 graphics card. What if you compare the Z3660 with a more modern add-on card, not one that was ever really available for the Amiga in its heyday? I mean, why do that? Well, the Z3660 itself is using more modern technology, so why not compare it against something more similar to that? And what I did here was to measure performance also against a BFG 9060 running at the same clock speed with a Voodoo 3 running via Prometheus to provide the PCI slots. And again, it's really difficult to draw conclusions here because on some occasions, some of those tests, the Voodoo 3 is faster, in other ones it's slower, and overall it really depends. I think what I draw from all of this is RTG on the Z3660 stands up very well against other graphics cards, and really it really comes down to what you're doing as to how, on a relative basis, fast or slow the Z3660 seems. That's RTG, but what about Ethernet speed? Well, I looked at that also, but to be honest, the results are pretty difficult to interpret. You can see here I was testing with Amega Speed Test, and to begin with at 50 megahertz, and the figures here are kilobits per second. But the really weird thing here is that the download speed is 804, whereas uploads over 4,000. There's a big differential, in other words, between how fast I'm able to download and how fast I can upload. And I tested this a number of times and got consistent results. The results get that bit more confusing when I add in the 100 megahertz figures because the download speed improves nicely, although still relatively low, but the upload speed reduces. Again, this was a repeatable thing that I found, so it's all very difficult to explain. From talking to people on the Z3660 Discord, there's possibly a number of different things going on here. First of all, there was some suggestion that because the bandwidth Amigas can download at all is relatively low compared to modern devices, when I'm doing the download test from an external server, the server might actually be over throttling the download because the bandwidth is lower than it really is expecting. And that explains why the download is much lower than the upload speed. So there might be an element of that. The only thing I would say is that I did get similar kinds of speeds when I was testing moving a large file across my local area network from one server to the Amiga or Mac again. I got similar kinds of speeds. What I would say though is I know sHaNsHe is working on some updates to the software and he is getting much faster speeds of the order of 13,000 kilobits per second. So certainly looking forward to that when that lands. But for now, these are the speeds I'm getting with the version of the firmware and software that I'm using. Let's compare this against an alternative networking card, and for that I use the CrossSurf 100 that happens to be in my machine with the BFG card in it. You can see there the figures I got from Amega Speed Test, 4,380 download, upload 6,800. So again, the download speed slower than the upload speed, which might be that server throttling point I mentioned before. But whichever way you cut it, those figures are that much higher than the Z3660 ones. As I say, this may all come down to firmware and drivers. So I think in terms of Ethernet speed, we have to say the case is not closed yet on this. as far as the Z3660 is concerned. For now, the performance a little bit disappointing with download, but there is the potential there for that to be improved significantly going forwards. Now, I didn't provide benchmarks for AHI and MHI. I'm not sure exactly how you benchmark that, but you've heard what that sounds like earlier in this video, so nothing more to say on that. But I can probably guess what you're thinking right now, and that is, it's all very well talking about benchmark results. What I really want to see is how this affects actual applications, and in particular, why don't you show us some games and what the Z3660 is like on gaming? Well, let's do just that, and here is Quake running in the software rendering mode on the Z3660, using it both for RTG output and AHI. So let me just let that play for a minute, and then we'll come back to benchmarks. So what frame rate did I get on Quake with the Z3660 in various configurations? Well, you can see here the results of that. I averaged time demos 1, 2 and 3 in Quake across the different clock speeds and emulation that you can use. At 50 megahertz, 7.4, let's call it, frames a second. To be honest with you, that's not really playable in my view. But once you get to 100 megahertz, you see basically a doubling in the frame rate, 14.5 frames a second. That's beginning to get a little bit more playable. And by the time you use emulation instead, which by the way works really well, you get to 21 frames a second. So probably if Quake is your thing, then the emulation is the way you're going to want to go. But even at 100 megahertz, the Quake is certainly a playable game. But once again, how does the Z3660 compare to any other card? Well, let's have a look at that, where here I'm comparing at 100 megahertz because I think that's the more playable frame rate against the BFG 9060 at the same frame rate. You can see the BFG is that bit faster, 17.5 frames a second, which puts it about 20% faster. And I think that's down to the memory access time on, or the bandwidth that the BFG provides over and above the Z3660. As I say, maybe that's something that will get improved with time as the firmware matures. But overall, a very creditable result from the Z3660, which, as I've said before, isn't solely about being the fastest card around, it's about being the most capable card around. And that brings us to the Wrangler ratings for the Z3660, and I'm going to take into account everything I've found out in the first and second parts of this video about the card. What have we learned? Well, first of all, we got a core card there that supports the 68060 in 50 and 100 megahertz configurations, and there aren't many cards that can do that. Obviously, you've got to find an 060 that supports 100 megahertz for that, but nevertheless, the card itself is able to run in that configuration. On top of that, we have the onboard emulation provided by the ARM processors. And of course, as I showed, you can run that without a native 68060 chip at all. So that might be of interest to some. Additionally, the Z-Turn daughter board adds a great many other features. We've got RTG, Ethernet, MHI and AHI audio support. We've got SCSI to SD, and we've got all that added memory that the Amiga can access. All in all, that makes it a rather compelling accelerator card for the Amiga. But there are a few shortcomings just at the moment with the card in its current configuration and somewhat in its infancy still. I mentioned just now the Ethernet speed isn't quite what I was expecting. Moreover, the memory access speed is a little bit slower than peer group cards. On top of that, we are limited to 16-bit RTG displays, no 32-bit or 24-bit if that's your thing. But there's every hope that with improvements to the software and the firmware of the card, that some of those things at least will get resolved in time, or certainly improved from where they are in this pair of videos. I think the other thing we've got to take into account is the cost of this card, which was relatively inexpensive. Perhaps the way to think about it is that you can get the support for 060 and the emulation for the price of another accelerator, and the other features of the card, such as RTG, Ethernet, etc., all come for free. I think that really demonstrates what good value the 3660 is compared to other alternatives. In the round, I've been incredibly impressed with the card, and the more I've used it, the more impressed with it I've got. The fact that all these add-ons are found on the expansion card itself means that I've got all my Zorro slots in my Amiga free for other things, should there be anything else I want to add to the Amiga. But the fact that they're all provided by one card, which sorts out a lot of the issues with compatibility, etc., really is something to be enjoyed. As perhaps you could tell from everything I've said about this card over the two parts of this video, I've been super impressed with it. I really am in love with it. It's a great addition to the Amiga hardware lineup, and hats off to sHaNsHe for creating it. With that, let's bring this video to an end, so do join me again next time for more adventures in retro computing. Bye for now.